March 26, 1945. World War II is screaming toward its apex, a jagged symphony of steel and fire. General George S. Patton, the firebrand commander of the U.S. Third Army, is at the height of his power, racing across the Rhine with a velocity that defies military logic. But in the shadowed corridors of command, a deeply personal obsession is about to clash with strategic necessity. This action will threaten to unseat one of America's greatest generals and shatter the very structure of Allied leadership. This is the story of Hammelburg, a mission born of blood, bound by family, and doomed by ego. To understand the Hammelburg raid, one must first confront the complex, often contradictory psyche of General George S. Patton, Jr. This wasn't merely a tactical commander. He was a man driven by a perceived destiny, believing deeply in reincarnation and the pursuit of eternal glory. Archival diaries and private correspondence from this period reveal a leader constantly wrestling with his own public image, the old blood and guts persona, and the profound, almost crushing pressure to outperform his rivals, particularly British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Patton felt the clock of history ticking, and he feared the war would end before his greatest masterpiece was painted in the soil of Germany. By March 1945, Patton's Third Army was a relentless, high-octane machine. They had broken out of Normandy, raced across the face of France, and executed the legendary relief of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. Now they were on the verge of collapsing the German heartland itself. The logistical triumph of the Rhine crossing, a feat Patton executed with characteristic audacity at Oppenheim, cemented his status as a master of mobile warfare. However, beneath this strategic triumph, a personal storm was brewing within the Mahogany Row offices of Third Army headquarters in Nancy. Patton was no longer just fighting the Wehrmacht. He was fighting his own heart. Patton's staff officers, including his devoted but increasingly worried Chief of Staff, Major General Hobart Argay, were observing a shift in their commander's focus. Patton was becoming obsessed with intelligence reports trickling in regarding Oflag 13B. This was no ordinary prisoner of war camp. Located near the town of Hammelburg, nearly 80 kilometers behind the fluid and lethal front lines, it held a prize that Patton valued above strategic objectives. Declassified daily war diaries suggest Patton spent hours staring at the coordinates of this specific camp, ignoring the broader movements of the 12th Army Group. The crucial figure at Hammelburg was Lieutenant Colonel John K. Waters, a veteran cavalry officer and the husband of Patton's daughter, Beatrice. Waters had been captured during the disastrous battles in Tunisia years prior. For Patton, the imprisonment of a family member was a stain on the family honor that he felt personally responsible for cleaning. General Omar Bradley, Patton's immediate superior, was aware of Waters' situation but maintained a professional distance. For Patton, however, the line between the general and the father had completely dissolved, creating a dangerous conflict of interest that violated the core tenets of military leadership. Patton's obsession with Hammelburg began to infect operational planning at the highest levels. He demanded a rapid push toward the area, ostensibly to prevent the Germans from moving POWs further east. But his staff knew better. This dynamic created dangerous friction within the Allied leadership hierarchy. General Dwight D. Eisenhower was currently prioritizing the massive encirclement of the Ruhr and the decisive drive toward Berlin. Eisenhower viewed any diversion of armored assets for personal motives as a threat to the overall campaign timeline. Patton was walking a tightrope over a chasm of professional ruin. Against the explicit advice of his senior intelligence and logistical officers, Patton finalized his fatal decision on March 26th. He bypassed his corps commanders, an act of professional insubordination that bypassed the very men responsible for the lives of the soldiers involved. He summoned Brigadier General William M. Hogue of the 4th Armored Division. Patton's orders were curt, direct, and left no room for debate. He wanted a fast-moving task force to punch a hole through the German line and not stop until they reached the gates of Oflag 13B. To lead this hazardous mission, Patton selected Captain Abraham Baum, a 24-year-old officer who embodied the aggressive spirit of the 4th Armored. Baum was a decorated veteran of the Western Front, but he was intentionally kept in the dark about the mission's true purpose. Patton and his inner circle feared that if the rank and file knew they were risking their lives for a single relative of the general, morale would collapse. Instead, Baum was told the raid was a priority mission to disrupt German reinforcement routes and gather intelligence on the weakening Wehrmacht presence in the interior. The formation of Task Force Baum was a masterclass in tactical compromise and logistical neglect. Patton demanded a force that was fast enough to evade detection, but heavy enough to survive an encounter with German armor. The result was a fragile hybrid: 16 Sherman tanks, 28 half-tracks, and roughly 300 men from the 10th Armored Infantry Battalion. They were stripped of their standard long-range radio equipment to save weight, effectively cutting them off from any hope of reinforcement or aerial support once they crossed the line of departure. The logistical failure of the plan was staggering to contemporary military analysts. Baum was expected to travel 80 kilometers through territory infested with retreating, yet still lethal, German units. They had no maps of the interior, no established supply lines, and no plan for what to do with thousands of liberated prisoners once the camp was reached. This was the Patton hubris in its purest form, the belief that sheer aggression could substitute for sound military doctrine. It was a gamble where the stakes were the lives of 300 men and the reputation of the American military. The atmosphere at the assembly point near Aschaffenburg was thick with a sense of impending doom. The men of Task Force Baum checked their weapons: M1 Garands, 50 caliber machine guns, and the 75mm cannons of their Shermans, with the grim silence of men who knew they were being sent into a meat grinder. Major General Gay privately noted in his diary that the mission had less than a 50% chance of success. Patton, however, remained resolute, his ego acting as a shield against the mounting evidence of a disaster in the making. On the evening of March 26, the silence of the German countryside was shattered as Task Force Baum roared to life. The crossing of the main river was the first test, and it was a bloody one. German resistance in Aschaffenburg was unexpectedly fierce, with snipers and Panzerfaust teams taking a toll on the lead elements. Baum realized quickly that the collapsing German army was still capable of biting back with lethal precision. The mission's timeline, already razor-thin, began to slip away in the smoke of the first engagement. The drive toward Hammelburg was not a clean breakthrough. It was a brutal 80-kilometer slugfest. Task Force Baum moved like a lightning bolt through a series of terrified German villages, their headlights cutting through the darkness and attracting every German unit in the sector. For the German civilians, it was a terrifying glimpse of the end of the world. For Baum, it was a desperate race against a ticking clock, as every kilometer gained meant more German units were closing the gap behind them. Patton watched the fragmented, static-filled reports with growing anxiety from his command post. He knew that the eyes of Bradley and Eisenhower were shifting toward his sector. If Task Force Baum was annihilated and the secret of John Waters came to light, it would be the end of old blood and guts. The very leadership hierarchy of the Third Army was now held together by the thin hope that a young captain could perform a miracle in the heart of enemy territory. As dawn broke on March 27th, Task Force Baum was a battered shadow of its former self. They were deep in the German interior, isolated, low on fuel, and surrounded by an enemy that was rapidly consolidating. Captain Baum, still unaware of why he was truly there, pushed his men forward through the morning mist. The dice had been thrown by a general in a comfortable headquarters, but it was the soldiers in the mud who would pay the price for his personal mission. As the raid pushed deeper into the German heartland, the tactical absurdity of the mission was met by a professional and ruthless German response. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the smiling Albert of the Italian campaign, had just taken command of the Western Front. He saw the American thrust not as a rescue mission, but as a golden opportunity to trap and destroy a high-profile American unit. He ordered elements of the 11th Panzer Division, the legendary Ghost Division, to pivot and intercept. The hunter was now becoming the hunted. The American advance through the dense, claustrophobic forests of the Spessart Mountains was a nightmare. German Panzerfaust teams, hidden in the thick undergrowth, turned the narrow roads into a graveyard of American steel. Every bend in the road held the potential for a lethal ambush. Task Force Baum was losing tanks and half-tracks at an unsustainable rate. The psychological toll on the men was immense. They were fighting a war in a vacuum, with no knowledge of the front line and no hope of rescue if they fell. Finally, on the afternoon of March 27, the smoke-blackened remnants of Task Force Baum reached the outskirts of Hammelburg. The gates of Oflag 13B stood before them. Inside, the thousands of Allied officers, men who had survived years of starvation and the psychological torture of captivity, heard the thunder of American 75mm guns. The camp erupted. This was the moment Patton had dreamed of. But the reality was far from the glorious liberation he had envisioned in his journals. The scene inside Oflag 13B was one of total, unmitigated chaos. Thousands of prisoners streamed into the yard, some cheering, others weeping, all of them looking to Captain Baum for a way out. But Baum looked back at them with a sinking heart. He had arrived with only a handful of operable half-tracks and tanks. He had no way to transport 3,000 men back 80 kilometers through enemy lines. The logistical vacuum of Patton's plan had finally collapsed in on itself. Amidst this frantic scene, the mission's secret objective was nearly extinguished. Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, recognizing the American uniforms, attempted to approach the German camp commander to negotiate a peaceful surrender of the facility. In the confusion and high tension, a nervous German guard fired a single shot. The bullet struck Waters in the abdomen, causing a life-threatening wound. The very man Patton had sent 300 soldiers to save was now bleeding out on the cold ground of the camp he was supposed to leave. With German armor reported only minutes away, Captain Baum was forced to make a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He could only take a few hundred men. He prioritized the highest-ranking officers and those fit enough to cling to the outside of the tanks. The rest, including the critically wounded Waters and thousands of others, had to be left behind. The liberation had lasted less than 2 hours before turning into a desperate flight for survival. Task Force Baum, now a slow-moving target burdened with half-starved POWs, began the retreat. But the Germans had slammed the door shut. The route they had used to enter was now blocked by Panther tanks and heavy anti-tank guns. The night of March 27th was a continuous rolling battle through the darkness. The American soldiers, who had not slept in over 40 hours, were hallucinating from exhaustion. Yet they continued to fire into the shadows of the German woods. The psychological analysis of this moment reveals the true cost of leadership failure. Baum's men were dying for a cause they didn't understand, while the POWs they had rescued were being mowed down by German crossfire in the back of open half-tracks. By the morning of March 28th, the task force was out of fuel and down to its last boxes of ammunition. They were trapped in a small valley near Lohr, surrounded by the veteran tankers of the 11th Panzer Division. The final stand was brief and brutal. The last American Shermans were picked off one by long-range German fire. Captain Baum, wounded himself, realized the end had come. He ordered his men to scatter and try to reach American lines on foot. Most were captured within hours. Of the 300 men who started the raid, only 35 eventually made it back to Third Army lines. The rest were killed, wounded, or returned to the very POW camps they had tried to liberate. The command fallout was immediate and devastating. When General Omar Bradley received the full report of the task force's destruction, his fury was legendary. He viewed Patton's actions as a wild goose chase that had wasted precious armored assets at a critical juncture of the war. Declassified National Archive reports show that Bradley considered relieving Patton of command on the spot, deterred only by the potential PR disaster it would cause for the Allied effort so close to victory. Patton's personal diaries from late March 1945 are uncharacteristically somber. He initially tried to deflect blame, claiming the raid was a legitimate diversionary tactic. But the wounding of his son-in-law and the loss of an entire task force weighed heavily on him. He had gambled with the lives of his men to satisfy a personal debt, and he had lost. The friction between his ego and his duty had reached a breaking point, nearly dismantling the leadership hierarchy he had spent a lifetime building. In the weeks that followed, the shadow of Hammelburg loomed over Patton's every move. While he continued to lead the Third Army to victory, his relationship with Eisenhower and Bradley was permanently scarred. Eisenhower, who valued team players above all else, never fully trusted Patton's judgment again. The raid became a whispered scandal in the mess halls of the 12th Army Group, a cautionary tale of what happens when a great captain forgets that his first duty is to his soldiers, not his family. The ultimate cost of Hammelburg was the loss of innocence for the men of the 4th Armored Division. They had been used as pawns in a personal game. Lieutenant Colonel John Waters survived his wounds, thanks to the skill of Serbian POW doctors in the camp, but the scars of the raid remained. The logistical failure and strategic absurdity of the mission were eventually documented in the Army's official history, though Patton's personal involvement was downplayed for decades to protect the legend of the general in the high boots. Historical consensus today views the Hammelburg raid as the singular greatest mistake of Patton's career. It serves as a profound psychological study of leadership under pressure. It exposes how even the most brilliant tactical minds can be blinded by emotion and hubris. By examining the primary sources, the unit war diaries and the private letters, we see a human side of Patton that is far less heroic than the movie posters suggest. It was a moment of profound leadership failure that nearly cost the Allies one of their most effective commanders. George S. Patton Jr. died in December 1945, but his legacy remains a battleground of history. The Hammelburg raid is the dark thread in the tapestry of his greatness. It reminds us that in the theater of war, the most dangerous enemy a leader faces is often the one staring back from the mirror. Patton was a man of war, a man of destiny, and ultimately a man whose personal love for his family nearly brought down the very army he loved even more. Given the immense pressure of the 1945 offensive, do you believe Patton's decision to rescue his son-in-law was a deeply human act of loyalty, or was it an unforgivable breach of command that should have seen him stripped of his stars? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.